I think we will get started. My name is Jonathan Hearn. I'm the president of ASEN and doing our interview today with Eric Storm. I'll make introductions to him in just a minute, but first I'm going to make a few announcements about ASEN and things going on there, just so people will know. So the first thing to say is that applications are open for the Anthony D. Smith Visiting Fellowship to offer £5,000 to cover a stay for 2 months at LSE, at the Ideas Center. So if you're interested in that, go to the ASEN webpage at asen.acc/Smith. The next announcement is that the ASEN Summer School in Zadar in Croatia is this June is open for enrollment. So if you're interested in applying, please do. It's a week on the Dalmatian coast, nice food, discussing nationalism and ethnicity and all those kinds of things. So it's a very enjoyable session. It includes people like Sasha Bojic, Benedict Brickner, Leah David, John Fox, John Hutchinson, Simona Kuti, Gizem Krasniqi, Sinisha Milesevic, and Tamara Trost, Gordana Uzelac, and myself. So it's a nice band, a diverse band of nationalism scholars, and it's really enjoyable. So I encourage you to look into that. Also want to say that registration for the 2025 conference in April is open. That'll be in Budapest. We're being hosted by the CEU. And you can find out more about that and how to register at the ASEN website, asen.acc/conference. And then just to say, the next event like this, the next seminar, online seminar that we'll be running is on mechanisms of national solidarity. That'll be on, I think it's 6th of February, in which the authors in a recent theme section of Nations and Nationalism will talk about that theme. Danny Kaplan, Sinisha Milesevic again, Leah David, Dan Lanier-Voss, John Fox, Ishki Shoam. So that should be a very interesting discussion of solidarity in the state of nationalism. So please do look into that and join us again if that sounds interesting. The other thing I'll say before I get started is just people are accessing us through various platforms, through Zoom, YouTube, Facebook. Just use whatever platform you're on to send us questions. I can see the ones that are on Zoom, but David, our man behind the curtain, making things run, will pass on other questions to make sure they get to me. So with those preliminaries out of the way, let me say welcome to Eric Storm. He's the other guy in front of you right now. Eric is a senior lecturer in European history in the Institute for History at the Leiden University. And he is the author of the book we are discussing today, just recently out, called Nationalism, A World History. And I've had the pleasure of reading the book for the last couple of weeks and ask Eric some questions. So let me just say a few things about the book before I sort of get us rolling into the interrogation. It's a really panoramic synthesis of historical sources and accounts, very impressive kind of integration of a whole lot of different literature. So it really provides in kind of one place a lot of literature that in other places you've had to pursue through various routes. It's a really incredible sort of up-to-date synthesis of the literature from a historical perspective. I would say it's very erudite, but it wears its erudition lightly. It's very accessible, very easy to read, and I think will reach broader audiences beyond just those of us intensely interested in this topic. So it's a kind of sweeping introduction to the subject. And I think it offers a much needed perspective. Often the writing in this area is very, focused on Europe, European settler societies. There's a kind of lopsidedness to the literature. And this, in one book, you have something that really helps kind of redress that balance and help you keep seeing the thing from various different parts of the world. So much to its strength, complement, good success, and so on. It's a real pleasure to read. I'm going to ask Eric a few questions about the book, and just to kind of set things up, I would say the approach is modernist. It locates nationalism, its kind of crystallization in the 18th century around the great, political revolutions, American War of Independence and French Revolution. So it's kind of modernist in that sense, and it takes that as the sort of starting point. Begins in the first chapter looking kind of pre that period in kind of medieval, early modern history in Europe at some of the kind of precursors of ethnic, national type cultural categories that were in play, but weren't really, crystallized into what we think of as modern nationalism. And then works through various periods historically, as a history often does. Various, periods of, a few decades or so. And each of these periods is kind of defined by a kind of different wave of nation formation, nation building. And internally, the chapters have a kind of repeating structure, which is to look at the start at the sort of distinct phase of nation formation that you're looking at the beginning of for that chapter. And then it looks a bit at the development of the idea of citizenship, which is kind of treated as a sort of a central organizing idea. And then goes on to look in the latter part of each chapter at developments of what we might broadly call culture, both kind of in the symbolic sense, but also in the representational sense, but also in the sort of material sense. I was trained as an anthropologist, and I'm used to the idea of material culture, and I kept feeling like I was getting a strong sense of that here. So it's one of those kind of books where, if you were interested in, one of the many themes that we look at, like food, tourism, sports, world fairs, which Eric has done a lot of work on, architecture. You can easily just kind of go to the index of this book and then find many examples and get a starting point for looking at that topic more deeply. And that's one of the things that's very nice about having such a broad synthetic book. And I would say I'll leave that to get on to my questions. But so I want to start to say, thanks for letting me talk at you for a bit, Eric, and now let's converse. In regard to those kind of three themes that I was emphasizing in the organizing the chapters, you generally see kind of waves of nation formation linked to kind of wider political, economic, geopolitical, imperial, processes going on. It seem to be the triggers at various stages for these kind of waves. And so I just wanted to, as opposed to, trying to explain each case by endogenous causes, within that particular nation state formation. So I wanted to ask you if you could say something about how you arrived at that perspective, because it is very basic to how you organized the whole book.
So thank you for the nice introduction and also the great kind of summary of the structure of the book. I myself began I did my PhD on Spanish history. And so as an outsider of Spanish history, I really found explanations that really presented Spanish history as different, unique, a bit awkward, because I saw many parallels with other cases that I knew from my education in the Netherlands. Mm-hmm. And so after my PhD, I decided that I wanted to do comparative history. So I did a few studies which had a strong comparative perspective, mostly comparing Spain with Germany and France or other European countries. And so I was already a bit skeptical of national internal explanations. Especially as historians, we have a strong preference for national case studies. And so most of us focus on one national case, and then historians, we tend to focus on differences and not on similarities. So in the end, we end up with each nation has a different path, a different trajectory, and in a sense is unique. And in that way, historians come to the same conclusions as nationalists. So there's a very close link between history writing and nationalism. And so from my background, I was already a bit skeptical of this, and I was very much triggered by the writings of Andreas Wimmer. So first of all, his article on methodological nationalism, so that we should avoid what we as historians also tend to do, to focus on just one case and exclude transnational influences and present this particular case as unique. And then I was also very much influenced by his book Waves of War, in which he really presents a case that new nation states were created because there was a geopolitical window of opportunity. So the age of revolutions, or the end of the First World War, or the end of the Second World War and the decolonization period, and maybe the last window of opportunity was 1989. And Wimmer's book is well, he's a sociologist. It's a lot of his book is quite unreadable because of a lot of statistics in it. So I had this in the back of my mind, and when I wrote the book, I really kind of found that my views really confirmed his views as well. So I tried to really illustrate as a historian how these windows of opportunities function. And another element that I wanted to do is also to get away from the nationalist and nationalist movement themselves, and really try to give a more structural perspective of the rise of nationalism. So not as a case-by-case occurrence, but really as a kind of structural process that quickly encompassed the entire world. So this led me to a quite different perspective than well, at least most traditional historical works on nationalism. Yeah.
We may come on to the question of, these almost like opportunity structures, moments of opportunity, still leaves us with the question, but why is it that the nation state is the thing that keeps moving into that space of opportunity? But, I'll come back to that question. But and I'm reminded also of, was it Eric Hobsbawm's quip that historians are to nationalism as opium growers are to heroin addicts, that kind of caution you're expressing. Can I also ask you about the theme of citizenship? Because it's, very often the key team organizing concept for talking about nationalism is ethnicity as opposed to citizenship. And we all know the kind of sliding back and forth and tensions between civic and ethnic definitions of nations. So could you tell us a little bit more about, how conscious that decision was to focus on citizenship?
So the idea to write a book already was an idea I already had for quite some time, but the idea to focus on citizenship came quite late, I think. And so there is a lot of information on ethnicity as well in the book. So I focus on the creation of languages, on the role of census taking, on also racial views later on. But I was also very much influenced by Michael Bielick's book on banal nationalism. And so if we look at today's world, probably the most visible expression of nationalism is during Olympic Games and football World Cups. And so what you see at football World Cups is not ethnically defined nations, but it's only independent states that are allowed to participate in these World Cups. And so I start my book with the example of Cameroon, which is one of the best, most successful teams from Africa. And Cameroon has over 200 languages and hundreds of ethnic groups, but still everybody really forms an imagined community talking about the national team during the World Cup, and they cheer their national team as well. So the dominant expression of nationhood really is connected to the nation state, and so this is about today, but it's also in the origin. So when in the French Revolution, sovereignty was transferred from the king to the nation, the revolutionaries had to define what is the nation, who belongs to the nation. And so there was no question about German-speaking Alsatians or Bretons or Basque. It was no issue. They belonged to the French nation. So language and ethnicity was no issue. And on the other hand, people under 25 were excluded, even though they spoke French or were part of the core ethnic group. Women were excluded, servants were excluded, monks were excluded, and ethnic religious minorities like Protestants and in the end also Jews were also included. So the nation was not defined as a cultural or ethnic community, but as the community of citizens. Mm-hmm. And this really opened a perspective that also at later stages, when you have a new nation state, you have to define who gets full citizenship rights. And so you get a story of emancipation movement. So probably the best known is female emancipation, but you also see Jewish emancipation, emancipation of the lower classes, in the Americas of indigenous population, of African Americans. So you see a very different story, and this also applies to immigration waves. So in the United States, there was a very clear preference for white immigration. So the first nationality law even explicitly said that only white immigrants of good character could acquire American citizenship. So you see a lot of processes of inclusion and exclusion that become visible if you really focus on citizenship. And so nowadays we probably take that for granted, but it really has a very fascinating history behind it, of all these processes of inclusion and exclusion. And nowadays it is very prominent again in speaking about asylum seekers or immigrants or illegal immigrants. So it still is a very burning issue, who belongs to the nation.
Yeah, I mean, I think, in my own senses, it's interesting that it, if you start with the 18th century and those revolutions, that citizenship is going to become the kind of linchpin idea is kind of predictable. But it's also that what happened then was, feel free to disagree with me, but what happened then was kind of the first great opening, where this whole idea of the political systems got their legitimacy from inherited right to rule from aristocratic classes and from church authority. You could see that was just kind of crumbling. It was losing its grip on middling and wider populations. So that, the first big opening is that one, which means you have to completely reinvent how you legitimate rule, right?
Yeah.
I mean, does that seem like a fair kind of statement of
No, sure. The Enlightenment really undermined the existing system, the ancien regime. Yeah, that's clear. Yeah. So it did not come out of the blue. The ideas were already there. Yeah.
Can you, kind of thinking more about the second parts of each of these chapters. Again, as I said before, I was trained as an anthropologist, not a sociologist. So, our word is culture, and I was just kind of interested in, how you were thinking about culture here, because you have a very kind of, like I said, sort of almost material, technological notion of culture at some points, and then it's also clear that it is connected, as you say, to the kind of the current wave of sort of everyday Billig's banal nationalism. It's a lot of that research is very kind of micro and looks at particular things going on today because nationalism is so bedded in. But one of the things you give us is a sense of that bedding in having a very long history to it. I mean, are there? I don't know. Do you have a culture concept that you're working with, or is it just sort of come naturally and implicitly?
Yeah, well, as a student, I was very much influenced by Michel Foucault, no? So this focus on discourse and hegemonic ideas that really kind of structure the way people view the world at certain times. But quite quickly, as a historian, I became not so much interested in how these epistemes disciplined or created a stable paradigm, but I was especially interested in how they changed. So how these paradigms, how these views on the nation changed over time. And over time, I also became less interested in discourse, because if you study discourse, you will have to look at the nationalist, and I just wanted to get away from the nationalists themselves. And so I was became much more interested in practices. So not so much the rhetorics, because there are a lot of hollow words when you listen to nationalists. Yeah. But what did it actually mean for ordinary people in their daily lives? So the original title that I proposed to the publisher was Nationalizing the People, and then a world history of nationalism. So it's not so much on nationalist movements, the book, but it's on how a nationalist worldview slowly became accepted and the common frame of reference. And so I wanted to show how this was present in high culture, so both in literature, in painting, in architecture, but also in the sciences, so in history writing, in economics, in political science, and very fascinating is statistics, for instance. So statistics are gathered by nation state. So not by ethnicity, but in general by nation state. And so you can only compare nation states. So it's very difficult to get statistics, for instance, of the North Sea coast areas of different countries or of the Rhine Delta. But it's very easy to compare national cases. So nationalism or the national order is already ingrained in the modern sciences. And so this was another part. And then I was also very much interested in how nationalism really transformed the physical environment. So for instance, by creating national parks, by the architecture, the statues, national theaters, but also by food. So national dishes are a quite late invention. So national cuisines were invented mostly towards the end of the 19th century. So that we now go to an Italian or a Mexican restaurant is something that has become really part of our everyday life and really helps us to internalize or to naturalize this nationalist worldview. And so I do not have I just had several spheres of culture in mind, but not a fixed concept, because it also changes over time. So the early 19th century is very different from, well, in my last chapters, I also have to deal with the impact of internet, for instance, and social media. So it's a very different kind of cultural sphere in a sense.
Yeah, no, that account you just sort of gave, of how in statistics and various things it's kind of written into the developing sciences and humanities and stuff is very what can I say? I mean, it kind of reminds you that the methodological nationalism thesis isn't just about a mistake that we're making now.
Yeah,
it's deep. Yeah,
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 yeah.
yeah,
And it's also in economics or in political science, it's either you study domestic economic developments or domestic politics, or you study international relations. So it's even two separate
yeah,
disciplines. And in economics, it's also either you do international trade and international economics, or you do national economics. So the the international system is in a sense already ingrained in the way the social sciences are organized, and in history writing it's very similar as well. So it's very difficult also to overcome that, and
yeah, yeah. No, here where I am, we have a Department of Politics and International Relations, and it's a bit like two different departments at times.
yeah, yeah,
Just for that reason, not
yeah.
criticism or anything. But yeah, I know what you mean. Um, can I ask you about another thing that just struck me that uh, you emphasize, especially in kind of the earlier chapters, that um, in many ways the most salient distinction that a lot of nation builders were making in terms of who's included and who's excluded, as we were talking about earlier, uh, is really couched not so much in terms of race and ethnicity; those things tend to kind of come later, but in a kind of distinction between the civilized and the uncivilized. And is that I don't know, is there some Norbert Elias inspiration there, or is it, how did you arrive at that? Because I think I find it compelling, but, can you tell me a little more? Yeah.
Yeah, I, I think there's a great book by Pierre Rosanvallon, the
Hmm.
French political scientist, on electoral systems in France, especially focusing on the French Revolution. And he makes clear that the basis to exclude, so the main criterion to award active citizenship was independent faculty of reasoning. So you needed to be independent. So that's why servants and monks were excluded. And you needed to have um, good rational faculties. So that's why minors were excluded. But this was also the reason why women were excluded. So women were thought not to be fully rational beings. And in addition, women were also seen as part of the family. So it was basically about being rational and independent. And so this is very closely connected also to civilization. So what we see in the Americas, that people were excluded as also being comparable to minors, so not yet full-grown rational beings.
Yeah.
And so what we see, for instance, with how Native Americans were treated, so many, especially in, I think until the 1960s, many kids were taken away from their families and brought to boarding schools where they had to dress in civilized Western clothing, and have also the hairdo should be civilized in a sense. And so there was really a very strong assimilation policy to turn them into civilized beings. And the
And they were,
same,
but,
yeah, the same also with immigration policy. So civilized immigrants were allowed, and there were all kinds of attempts to keep out and even to completely bar so-called uncivilized foreigners. Um,
Yeah. No, I was just going to mention that, from America, but the, you know, collection of tribes kind of in the south, kind of north of the Florida Panhandle, were often referred to as the civilized tribes
Mhm.
because a lot of them had adopted Christianity and were, adopting farming techniques and things that were more like that. And so that distinction also divided Native American communities. And I believe some of the treaties and constitutional documents almost literally define Native Americans as wards of the state, as it were.
Mhm. Yeah, yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah,
So,
yeah.
um,
True.
so it does. Yeah, it's an interesting.
Yeah. And it's civilization is also a criterion to include or exclude people to international law. So
Mhm.
so the Ottoman Empire and China, for instance, were not fully accepted as full partners in international law, and even primitive tribes. So treaties with primitive tribes were not valid for international law. So international law only applied to civilized nation states or to
Mhm.
civilized states. And I think still, when there is a border conflict in Africa, treaties that were made with local tribes are not recognized by in international law because these tribes were not civilized state actors, so they are not fully recognized. So civilization here also really functioned as a criterion to include or exclude, and obviously racial prejudices and racial thinking. Yeah, but I found civilization, yeah, very useful to look into um, how these differences, both internally and externally, were made. Yeah.
It's it's interesting because it's a concept that is often articulated so it ranges over various nation states, right? Civilizations in the plural, right?
Yeah.
But I mean that kind of leads me on to another question, which is the question of nationalism and empire and imperialism. Um, how I mean a lot of I don't know what to say. A lot of work recently has kind of pointed out that a lot of theories of nationalism have just neglected the imperial context and how a lot of nation states are incubated first inside imperial frameworks. Um, uh, and what does this concept of empire have to do with this notion we were talking about earlier about these openings, these moments of opportunity that arise, and how much is empire, a part of that story, I guess.
Yeah. Maybe let's try to kind of answer it slightly different.
Mm-hmm.
I think the only existing history world history of nationalism is Hobsbawm's book, and Nations and Nationalism since 1780. So the
Mm-hmm.
book is over 40 years old, I think, and his view is still very traditional. So nationalism plays a role during the age of revolutions in Europe and the Americas. And then in 1848, it starts also in East Central Europe, and then it is exported to Asia, and then in the 20th century only it arrives in Africa, and he focuses then very much on the anti-colonial nationalist movements in the colonies.
Mm-hmm.
So it's a very much a diffusionist model, and so. What I discovered, there's a lot of good recent studies also that show that the world of the 18th and early 19th century was already very much connected. So there were Jacobin clubs in the Ottoman Empire and in
Mm-hmm.
India. Madagascar was very much aware of what was happening in Europe, and they had a reformist king in the early 19th century that was very much impressed by Napoleon, and he dressed as a French general. And he also tried to adopt several elements of the European nation state model. So my focus is not on how nationalism was kind of exported to the rest of the world, but how especially, well, a lot of intellectuals and middle classes were impressed by the new European nation states, especially. But there were a lot of princes and emperors and politicians that also began adopting several elements of the nation state in order to strengthen their state. So mostly this happened after a defeat. So the Ottoman Empire suffered several defeats, and after each defeat there is a new wave of reform. The same happened in China, but the best example is Japan, where the Meiji Restoration really succeeds in warding off foreign intervention by really adopting almost entirely the Western nation state model. But this is also what you see in Siam, so current day Thailand, in Ethiopia, in Madagascar, in Indian principalities in the early 19th century. So there's a lot of awareness of the success of the new nation states in Europe, that they're stronger, more modern, and that we need to adapt certain elements to be able also to stay independent, so not to become a colony. So in the end, it's much more that empires like China and Japan and the Ottoman Empire, they begin to adopt the nation state model and in the end transform into a nation state as well. So the distinction between nation states being modern and progressive and coming about through a revolution, and empires being outdated and old-fashioned. So I think this contradiction is not, it is much more complex. So all European nation states were empires as well. And if they didn't have colonies, they wanted them. And so a lot of Asian empires and also empires like Austria-Hungary or Russia or the Ottoman Empire began to adopt all kind of elements of nation states. So it is not a dichotomy, but they develop at about the same time. And what we see now is that the strongest nation states, China, Russia, and within 2 weeks or next week already, when Trump becomes president, we see new imperial inclinations in the biggest nation states as well. So maybe we get a return of empire.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, no, that's always one of those things I find myself puzzling over is what do you call this new version? I mean, is it just a really hegemonic nation state, or is it an empire, or is it an informal empire? You know, it can be quite you can swim around in your sort of definitions with that.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it does seem to be the part of what you're saying is you know, it's, you know, I think of Partha Chatterjee's famous kind of pushback against Benedict Anderson, Whose Imagined Community, where he's sort of saying, you know, this theory just leaves us with nothing but imitating, right? This modular form that you say has come out of Europe. And while there's truth to that, the account that you're giving us is also kind of, well, yes, there's appropriating what others have, you know, in some sense made a necessity. But as you say, the strategy of survival, of, you know, maintaining a stronger state, you know, there's active participation in becoming these things, you know, out of whatever kind of regime one had previously. um, and it makes it less of a. It problematizes the kind of account of the West, Europe just imposing itself on everybody, right?
Yeah, yeah,
There's agency on all sides, you
yeah,
know.
yeah.
Fascinating stuff.
Yeah.
Kind of keeping track of our time here. You also pay a lot of more attention than a lot of people do to kind of pan-nationalist movements, um, uh, and African, Arab, Slavic, the classic ones. Uh, is that something that you think has had its day, or do we still have pan-nationalisms?
Um, I guess that there is still, I paid attention to it because one of my goals really was to show that the nation is not a given. So that in different periods, different concepts of nationhood become more prominent as well. And so a nice example was when the Dutch Republic during the Age of Revolution and after French invasion became the Batavian Republic. It needed to have a new constitution. And
Mm-hmm.
so the question was, is the Dutch Republic, does it consist of one nation or does it consist of 9 nations? So do all the provinces constitute 9 different nations? And so that also implies, what model do we want? Do we want a centralized nation state like France, or do we want a federal state like the United States?
Mm-hmm.
And when Spain, during the Age of Revolution, adopted a constitution, the Spanish nation was defined as all Spaniards of both hemispheres. So it included the Americas, so all the American territories, but also the Philippines and all inhabitants in all these. So the Spanish nation state was enormous and covered 3 continents. And so these pan movements. So that another fascinating example that I encountered recently was that Catalan nationalists in the early 20th century were in favor of creating a federal Spain that also included Portugal, so that it would be really multilingual. So Catalan, Castilian, and Portuguese, and then maybe also Basque, but that it also then could have imperial expansion.
Mm-hmm.
So this concept of the nation was very fluid, and also I think one of the chapters or parts that surprised myself was the decolonization period. I thought this was a smooth transition from empire to independent nation states, but I discovered that there were a lot of attempts to really create larger federations, because many African leaders also were aware that their tiny states were probably not very viable. So there were all kind of attempts to create larger federations, and in the end, most of them failed. But this is a kind of forgotten history.
Yeah. Yeah.
So the nation and what a nation is rather fluid. So also demarcations between languages. So very contested. The Russians do not recognize Ukrainian as a different language. So it's a mere dialect.
Mm-hmm.
But there are a lot of examples of, one could even argue that Dutch is a German dialect and that we should belong to Germany, or the other way around, that German is a Dutch dialect.
Mm-hmm.
It is, the story of the nation is much more fluid than people think, and this was something that I focused on. So therefore, I also paid quite some attention to these pan movements
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
because yeah.
I think I recall he's suggesting that the super successful version is the European Union,
Yeah,
which we sometimes call the United States of Europe.
yeah,
It's, and the United States, similar to the Netherlands, exactly how these colonies were going to come together was not at all clear at the beginning. Yeah,
yeah,
yeah.
yeah.
Let me kind of start to wind us up here before we turn to asking our viewers for some questions. I mean, are there any particular key sources of inspiration? You've mentioned Andreas Wimmer, kind of Hobsbawm in some ways, and Billig. But is there? I mean, I guess I'm thinking of things like the Annales School or these kind of historical, approaches. Or are you flying solo, as it were, on this one?
Um, well, yeah, I think in the end, I'm inspired by a lot of people. So I also very much liked Gellner's book, and I'm also very sympathetic to Sinisa Malevich book, and I did a lot of on well, I also published some articles on forms of banal nationalism, so that was very influential as well. Um, but, I think in the end, I wanted to write a different book, and so I think I as you say, I fit in with the modernist school, but I'm also um, against this old-fashioned unilateral modernization process. So I think what struck me writing the book is that it's more a zigzag course. So it's not going in one direction, but it's there are a lot of important turning points in which nationalism and nation states go a very different direction, and it's very unpredictable where it goes, and I think this is something that we see nowadays. So my hope is that people get fed up with identity politics and voting populist politicians, but I'm not very sure if this really is going to happen. So things can get
Mm-hmm.
much worse even, but maybe
Yeah,
we go the other way. It's very unclear.
that sort of zigzag, you know, pattern you talk about is, you're right. It really problematizes the sort of old school modernist theory. What do you do to get these new nation states to catch up with the rest of us and all that stuff? But it also kind of problematizes things like Wallersteinian world systems theory, which has a kind of closure as well. I think that's one of the things that historians do for those of us in social sciences who theorize too much is it reminds us that sometimes it's just hard to predict because there's contingency.
Yeah,
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 sure.
absolutely. Um, is there? I mean, is there any? You came up to the precipice of giving us a prognosis of the future there, or at least a hope. Is there any other final words you want to say, or aspirations you want to express about the?
Well, I I also looked a bit at the climate problem, and
Mm-hmm.
so if we really want to solve the climate crisis, we probably should overcome the limitations of the nation state and really come to a truly international cooperation. But what we see is that climate activists, but even also animal activists, who some of them now apply to give award citizenship to animals as well. So another step in this emancipation process. But they still think in terms of a national or an international order consisting of nation states. Um, so I think nation states, they have their disadvantages, but it's the best thing we have. And probably what I hope is that the good thing of the international order based on nation states is that at least in theory, all nation states are equal. and so that we should respect the contribution of each of them. But I'm not sure if this really is going to happen at least in the coming 4 years. And yeah, so the picture is not very rosy at the moment, I think. Yeah.
Fingers crossed, shall we say.
Yeah, sure.
Okay, well, I think we've given you a good run for your money. I see that there are some questions coming up on the chat for Zoom, and so I will look at that. Whoops, sorry, it just moved for me there. Okay, so one question is, Eric mentioned the Constitution of Cadiz, which sets out that the Spanish nation is the reunion of all the Spaniards in both hemispheres. Reunion implies the gathering together of people who were previously separated. Is that a fair understanding of the meaning of the Constitution, trying to undo the independence of Spanish America? Well, there you go.
So maybe the Constitution is of 1812. So in fact, it was not trying to undo the independence of America, but it probably indirectly stimulated the independence of Spanish America. I think they just did what was sensible at the time, because there was already the idea of a kind of that citizenship should be awarded also not just to the inhabitants of the peninsula, but also to the inhabitants of Spanish America. But the problem was that there were more inhabitants in the Americas than in Spain, so they had to decide we should exclude a group of Spanish Americans. So they excluded all African Americans and the mestizos as well.
Yeah.
And so then the Americas had less representations in Spanish Parliament than Spain itself. But at about the same time, people in the Americas were not very. There in fact were three legitimate regimes at the time. So there was the brother of Napoleon, who had gotten the crown from the Spanish monarchy. There was the Bourbon king of Spain, who was effectively a prisoner in France. And then there was this new constitutional regime in Cadiz. And so it was very unclear who really was the legitimate sovereign. So it really inspired a lot of Spanish American cities to write their own constitution. So it was a kind of maybe more a kind of inspiration, and also feeling not just treated justly by the Spanish representatives. So the story is complicated, yeah, but yeah.
There's another question. I think that question, if I'm understanding the chat here, was from David, who's our technical host in the background. He's also asked us on emancipation. Yes, David Runciman has argued that everyone should be able to vote regardless of age. Is that where this emancipation momentum is heading?
Yeah, well, that would be the ultimate conclusion. What we see is a kind of a succession of waves of emancipation. So I found it very interesting that people now start to argue to give animals citizenship rights as well, and then like minors, they should be represented by others. But at least to give them passive citizenship rights. But I'm not very sure. Maybe we can lower the bar to 16 years, but further, I'm not very sure.
Yeah, I may have to admit I find myself get the question about animal rights as citizens so much of citizenship is driven by people saying, "Hey, I'm a citizen too,"
Yeah.
making the argument, and no animal's going to do that, and or 2-year-old. So, I have to admit, I'm a bit skeptical about how far that we can push that paradigm,
Yeah. Yeah.
it's an interesting idea. So, another question here from Raul Moreno Almadral says many previous general histories of nationalism were written by authors working on France, Britain, Germany, or the U.S. How has your previous expertise on Spain affected how you wrote the book? Yeah, because you're a bit of an outlier there in a way.
Yeah. Maybe the most concrete impact that I could think of is that over the past maybe 10, 15 years, I've been involved in various small Spanish research projects on different aspects of nationalism. And so they stimulated me to write on the impact of tourism, to write on banal nationalism. So they provided me with a group of people, of very intelligent people, to discuss issues, and so to really every 3-4 years discuss nationalism from a different perspective, and then with one specific case, but with dealing with different aspects of it, and obviously Spain has that the nation is not really taken for granted. So you have the Catalan and the Basque nationalist movements, so that it is a contested concept. So that makes it interesting. Yeah.
Okay. Questions are starting to pour in here. Here's a really big one from Mark Tassier. Can cosmopolitanism become a viable alternative for nationalism or to nationalism?
Yeah, I'm a bit doubtful. So I think what nationalism does, it appeals to the emotions, and that is why it is so strong, I think, in many ways. And this is much more difficult with cosmopolitanism. This is more, I think, an intellectual concept. Is very sensible, and I think many of us really would like or are cosmopolitans, but you won't cheer with the flag the cosmopolitanism, whereas I think many of us really sit and watch television to see the Olympic Games or another sport contest, and then we really cheer our national squad as well, I think. Yeah.
I don't know what you think. I mean, for me, it's also the idea of cosmopolitanism often doesn't address, but what kind of state are you going to have under that circumstance? Because as we were talking about earlier, international cooperation is desirable. The idea of solving the climate crisis by having one all-powerful Leviathan, global Leviathan, is more disturbing, to think about in some ways.
And the problem also is that in the end, the international structures that do exist, they depend on the goodwill of the states that are there. So there's no real power except for some moral deal, maybe. Then
there's a couple more questions here. One from Rachel. Do the stresses caused by both environmental change and by measures to address it strengthen the opportunity space for nationalist politics and nationalist policies? This is perhaps off topic, but does that also make it harder to address what is a transnational issue?
Yeah, I think if we think at it rationally, I think the climate crisis is something that we should solve with the all of everybody on Earth. So that really international cooperation is needed to address this problem, and that many climate crisis, so the big floodings in Central Europe, they crossed national borders. So these are transnational problems as well. But I think what we see is that that the solutions really are national, and that it's very hard to really to come to effective national cooperation, so that it could also easily lead to well, get national populism getting more space and more opportunities. So instability could be an effective ground for populist movement to flourish, unfortunately.
Yeah. Another, from a different angle, another question here from Itach. I hope I'm pronouncing that okay. Says, thank you. Eric mentioned Ottoman Empire in China a couple of times in terms of comparison of their specific nationalist fractions. Would it be possible for him to open his discussion a little bit more on that comparison? Does he compare the 19th century millet system or after that or before?
Um, yeah, I think I make a lot of comparisons, for instance, between the Ottoman Empire, China, Japan, Ethiopia, other countries. But I do not focus so much on where they came from. So the specific characteristics of the Ottoman Empire, the millet system, for instance, or the particular characteristics of early modern Japan or China. But I look more how they all, in a very similar way, adopt elements of the new nation state model. So I focus more on their very similar reactions to the nation state model and the structural changes that you can see there than on the national differences. So I really try to get away from the national particulars, and that is something I do throughout the book. So I really focus. I'm probably not a very typical historian in that sense. So I focus very much on similarities and not on differences. So I really try to detect patterns and similar developments.
Does that make you a more, I don't know, theory-ish historian? I mean, anytime you try to generalize or find similarities, there's at least a question of finding the right set of concepts to help you make those comparisons, right? But
Yeah.
historians notoriously are theory shy.
Yeah, I personally, I'm not very fond of theories either. And I think what my main objection to a lot of social science writings on nationalism is that they try to define the nation in one way, but what I see and also try to define concepts. But what I see is that over time, the meaning of words really change very profoundly, and also what a nation is changes profoundly. What nationalism is changes profoundly, and so I'm very hesitant to really to draw kind of. I also avoided making a typology. I avoided, I did not really come with a theoretical framework. So the one theoretical issue that is really in the book is I use a lot the concept of isomorphism. So that over time, slowly, all states became much more similar, so that there were all kind of mechanisms that kind of forced or stimulated states to adopt best practices from other countries, and so that the world nowadays is much more similar, much more um, similar than it has ever been, probably.
Have you ever looked at the work of the sociologist John W. Meyer?
Yeah, yeah.
This idea is very big.
Yeah, yeah. I took the concept from him, and but I didn't really delve into his books very extensively. Is it worthwhile or?
Worthwhile. Some of the, I mean, he writes often with other people, but yeah, I've tried to familiarize myself with his work, probably more
Yeah,
through
yeah,
articles
yeah.
than
Well, I read
yeah.
a few great articles because in recent times we also see that the IMF and the World Bank, for instance, they really and the World Health Organization, so they really im impose or come to shared standards of professionalism, of accounting, of medical treatments that are adopted globally, and so this isoformism still is a very dominant force, and it has the advantage that it enables you to really study the entire world as 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 a global system in a sense, and where very similar developments happen, and yeah.
I often find when I'm lecturing on globalization to a class full of students who are quite international themselves, you end up by saying, you are the evidence that Meyer has a point,
Yeah,
because you can the global university system is so uh, interchangeable is too strong, but
yeah,
you can travel within it, and
yeah.
yeah.
That's true.
Um, I'm so we've been going for about 50 minutes, close to it. I'm checking. I don't see any other messages from other platforms being passed over by David. Um, so unless he very quickly says, but wait, there's more. Um, I I think we will probably say, yeah, that's everything. He says, that's all, folks, as the cartoons used to say. Um, uh, So I think we've given it a very good examination, and I can just sort of repeat to everybody, it's a great thing to have on your coffee table. Uh, uh, I encourage people to get copies and read them. And with that, I think the last thing to do is just say thank you, Eric,
Yeah,
for
thank
writing
you.
the book and
Yeah, maybe I can add that there is already a Dutch translation,
oh
and there
yeah,
will be a Spanish and a Romanian translation as well.
good,
But they're still, well, in the process of translating, I hope.
yeah.
So it will take a while, but yeah,
That's great, and it's great that you're into translations, so soon after publication. That's
yeah, yeah,
a testament to the interest in the book.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, and thank you very
Okay.
much for the interview. It really was a pleasure to discuss these issues with you, and hopefully we meet again in person. Soon.
Sometime soon.
Yeah.
Okay. Great to see you.
Okay. Bye.
Bye bye.